Imagine a virus so incredibly contagious that you could just walk into a completely empty room, breathe the ambient air that an infected person exhaled like 2 hours ago and catch it.
Yeah, it's wild. And then imagine that same virus also acts like this malicious hacker, right? Just quietly deleting your immune system's memory of basically every other illness you've ever fought off.
It's terrifying. But we are welcoming you, the listener, to a deep dive into our source material today. We're looking at a routine part of modern life that honestly reveals this dramatic, high-stakes biological reality beneath the surface.
We are. We're looking at a microbiology document that covers one of the most recognized acronyms in public health, which is MMR.
Right.
And the core theme we need to establish immediately for you is that MMR is not one disease. It represents three distinct, completely biologically unrelated viral infections. They really only share a historical accident of biotechnology.
Which is so interesting.
Yeah. So today we're going to explore the biology of these three distinct villains, the brilliant science used to fight them, the major controversies, and why these classic viruses are actually making headlines again right now.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we go back to the early 1900s, right, diagnosing a child with a fever and a rash was almost like, I don't know, trying to read a really murky, low-resolution X-ray.
Yes, exactly.
Physicians were looking at this landscape of overlapping symptoms, and they genuinely struggled to tell these illnesses apart. It was a clinical grouping based purely on what things look like on the outside.
Right, but the underlying biology tells a completely different story. So measles is caused by morbillivirus hominis,
Okay.
which is a single-stranded RNA paramyxovirus. Now, usually, single-stranded RNA viruses are somewhat sloppy copiers when they reproduce.
Meaning they mutate.
Exactly, they can mutate rapidly. And that's actually a detail we should definitely keep in mind for later. But then mumps, on the other hand, is caused by the Rubella virus, which is an entirely different genus.
Wow. Okay.
And Rubella, which is sometimes called German measles, is a toga virus. So biologically, they're completely unrelated families. They have nothing to do with each other.
Three totally different viral families operating in completely different ways. Yet today, I mean, when someone says they're having the MMR, they aren't talking about catching a rash.
No, not
They're talking about receiving a single vaccine. So the acronym went from describing the problem to describing the solution.
Right, and that semantic shift happened in 1971. It was thanks to a Merck scientist named Maurice Hilleman.
Oh, right. Hilleman.
Yeah, he realized that all three of these could be grown as live attenuated strains and then delivered in a single injection. And it was a move made purely for logistics.
Just make it easier.
Exactly. 3 separate injections at 3 separate pediatric visits just meant lower completion rates. You know, parents miss appointments, life gets busy.
Yeah, of course.
So 1 visit, 1 needle, 3 protections.
When I was reading through the source material, I realized it's basically like getting a bundled streaming package.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, like you get Hulu, Disney, and ESPN for one price. Those channels have absolutely nothing to do with each other. They just share the exact same delivery vehicle to make our lives easier and to ensure we actually use them.
What's fascinating here is how that brilliant logistical move actually had an unintended side effect. It blurred our societal understanding of the very distinct threats each virus poses.
Because they're all grouped together in our minds.
Exactly. Because we get protected against them all at once, we tend to weigh them in our minds as equal dangers. But out in the real world, I mean, they behave incredibly differently.
Which brings us to measles, the absolute heaviest hitter of the group. The sources highlight that measles is almost always the first disease to return the exact moment vaccination rates drop in a community.
Always.
It is the ultimate canary in the coal mine, and the math behind how it spreads is just staggering.
It really is. So epidemiologists measure contagiousness using the basic reproduction number, or R0.
Right, they are not.
Yeah. This metric asks, in a fully susceptible population with absolutely no immunity, how many new people will one single infectious person go on to infect?
Okay, so what's the baseline for that?
Well, for seasonal flu, that number hovers roughly around 1 to 2. Early estimates for the original strain of COVID-19 were around, 2 to 3.
Okay.
The R0 for measles sits between 12 and 18.
Wow.
Yeah. It is the highest of any known human infectious pathogen.
Exponential growth of 12 to 18 people from a single case. And that comes down to the actual mechanism of transmission, right?
Exactly.
Because measles isn't just spread through, heavy respiratory droplets that fall to the ground quickly. It is truly airborne.
Highly airborne.
The virus aerosolizes and can remain infectious, just suspended in a room's ambient air for up to 2 hours after the infected person has left the building.
And that single biological mechanism drives everything about measles control. Because it is so uniquely contagious, the herd immunity threshold, meaning the percentage of a population that must be immune to stop the virus from finding new hosts, is exceptionally steep.
How steep are we talking?
It requires about 95% of the population to be immune. Compare that to polio, which requires roughly an 80 to 85% threshold.
That's a huge difference.
It is. A community might have a 90% vaccination rate against measles, which, sounds fantastic on paper, but that remaining 10% is more than enough fuel for a massive measles outbreak.
But the high contagion isn't even the wildest part for me.
Right.
The source material details this 2015 science paper by Michael Mina and his colleagues that just completely changes how we view a measles infection. This brings us back to that malicious hacker analogy. We're talking about immune amnesia.
Yeah, immune amnesia. For decades, public health officials noticed this really strange pattern. Whenever a population introduced the measles vaccine, overall childhood mortality from all infectious diseases would drop significantly.
Not just from measles.
Right. It dropped far more than what you would expect just by eliminating measles deaths alone. And the 2015 paper finally explained the biological mechanism behind this phenomenon.
Because the virus doesn't just make you sick with a fever and a rash. It actively targets and infects your memory B cells and memory T cells.
Yes.
And those are the specific cells your immune system uses to remember how to fight off previous infections, right? Like a cold or a stomach bug you had last year.
Exactly. By infecting and destroying those specific immune memory cells, the virus essentially wipes the hard drive of your immune system.
That is just wild.
It really is. Survivors of a natural measles infection are left partially immunodeficient. They're vulnerable to completely unrelated bacterial and viral infections for up to 2 to 3 years afterward, while their immune system slowly tries to relearn what it actually already knew.
Wait, so natural infection doesn't make your immune system stronger like people claim. It actually acts like a malicious hacker wiping your immune system's hard drive.
Yep, that's exactly what it does.
This completely dismantles that old pervasive misconception that natural infection is the safer path, or that getting sick naturally builds a stronger immune system. You aren't building strength. You are actively risking years of vulnerability to everything else in your environment.
Exactly. And plus, there were the direct long-term complications of the measles virus itself. You saw SSPE mentioned in the notes.
Subacute sclerosing panencephalitis? It sounds terrifying because it's not an immediate complication. It's a fatal neurological time bomb.
It's awful. It is a rare but devastating condition where a mutated form of the measles virus just persists in the brain. It strikes 7 to 10 years after the initial acute illness, leading to progressive brain degeneration and death.
Wow.
And it disproportionately affects children who caught the wild measles virus before the age of 2. The consequences of natural infection are profound, they're destructive, and they're very loud.
So measles is loud. It leaves a massive footprint and actively destroys the immune system. But the next virus in this bundle requires a total shift in our perspective.
It really does.
Because what if a virus is quiet? What if the person who catches it barely even gets sick, but the collateral damage to someone else is catastrophic? That is the reality of rubella.
Right. Clinically speaking, for a child who catches it, rubella is the mildest of the three. It usually presents as like a faint pink rash, maybe a low-grade fever and some swollen lymph nodes, and it just resolves in a matter of days.
So it's not a huge deal for the child.
No, the public health emergency surrounding rubella has almost nothing to do with the child who catches it.
It's driven entirely by fetal harm. If a non-immune woman contracts rubella during her first trimester of pregnancy, the virus doesn't just stay in her respiratory system, it crosses the placenta.
Yes.
And when that happens, the sources indicate there is an 80% chance of the fetus developing congenital rubella syndrome, or CRS.
And CRS is characterized by this devastating triad of conditions. You see congenital heart defects, cataracts, and other eye abnormalities, and sensorineural deafness.
That's heartbreaking.
It frequently results in severe intellectual disability, low birth weight, and very high rates of miscarriage. The virus actively disrupts the cellular development of the fetus right at the most critical window of gestation.
When I was reading the source material, the origin of the rubella vaccine really stood out to me because it wasn't a proactive measure against a mild rash. It was a desperate response to the sheer scale of the 1964 to 1965 epidemic in the U.S.
Yeah, that epidemic is really one of the darker chapters in modern epidemiology. The rubella virus circulated so widely through the general population that it inevitably reached pregnant women on just a massive scale.
How many cases were there?
There were an estimated 12.5 million rubella infections in the U.S.,
Yeah.
and that resulted in roughly 20,000 infants born with CRS, 11,000 fetal deaths and miscarriages, and the deaths of over 2,000 newborns.
Just an overwhelming catastrophe. And that drove a researcher named Stanley Plotkin to act. He developed what became known as the RA-273 rubella strain. And the RA in that name is a direct, sobering reminder of this history. It stands for Rubella abortus. Plotkin isolated the virus from the tissue of a fetus aborted during that exact epidemic, grew it, and attenuated it to create the vaccine that became the U.S. standard by 1979.
Which represents a profound shift in the very philosophy of why we vaccinate. The primary goal of the rubella vaccine program, historically, was not to protect children from a minor transient illness.
Right.
The strategy targeted children, alongside adolescent girls and women of childbearing age, to remove the virus from circulation entirely.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Rubella completely changes the social contract of vaccines. We aren't vaccinating children to protect the children themselves from a mild rash. We are vaccinating them to build a human shield around pregnant women and their unborn babies.
Exactly. It moves vaccination away from a purely individual benefit and turns it into a fundamental act of collective responsibility.
Which brings us to the third virus in this trio, mumps. If measles teaches us about brute force contagion, and rubella teaches us about collective responsibility, mumps teaches us about the practical, real-world limits of the vaccine itself.
Yeah, and why outbreaks can still happen even in highly vaccinated populations.
And mumps has this incredibly personal origin story. We talked about Maurice Hilleman earlier, the scientist who bundled the MMR shot.
Yeah.
In 1963, his 5-year-old daughter, Gerald Lynn, woke up in the middle of the night with the classic painful swelling of the salivary glands that mumps causes. He's a worried father, but he's also a virologist, so before taking her to the doctor, he just swabs her throat.
Right. He took that viral swab back to his laboratory at Merck and began a process called serial passage to attenuate it. Essentially, you take the human virus and introduce it to non-human cells, in this case, embryonated chicken eggs.
Wait, how does passing a virus through chicken eggs actually turn it into a medicine? Like, what does attenuating it biologically involve?
It's basically a process of forced adaptation. You know, viruses adapt to their environment to survive.
Okay.
So by forcing the mumps virus to replicate over and over in avian cells, the virus mutates to become highly efficient at infecting bird cells. But in doing so, it essentially forgets how to be highly efficient at infecting human cells.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it becomes weakened or attenuated for humans. When injected as a vaccine, it can still replicate just enough to trigger your immune system to create antibodies, but it is too weak to cause the actual disease. And that exact Gerald Lynn strain is still the foundation of mumps vaccines worldwide today.
That is a brilliant piece of biological engineering. But despite having this vaccine since the late 60s, mumps still occasionally surges. The sources detail a massive outbreak in 2006 in the American Midwest.
Yes.
There were over 6,500 mumps cases, and what's striking is that it was heavily concentrated among fully vaccinated college students living in dorms.
And when an outbreak occurs among a vaccinated cohort like that, the immediate reactionary assumption is often that the vaccine simply doesn't work. However, the data shows that the 2-dose MMR series is roughly 88% effective against mumps. That is a robust level of protection, but it's not 100%.
And it wanes over time, right? The immunity you get from the mumps component of the shot tends to decline faster than the immunity you get from the measles component.
Exactly. Combine that slowly waning baseline immunity with a specific environment of a college campus.
Oh, man.
Yeah, you have intense, prolonged, close contact exposure. Students were living in crowded dorms, shouting at loud parties, sharing drinks, sitting shoulder to shoulder in choir practices. That level of intense, repeated viral exposure can eventually overwhelm an imperfect, declining level of protection.
So, vaccine efficacy is a probability distribution, not a magical force field. If immunity is an umbrella, it works great in regular rain, but if you stand in a Category 5 hurricane like a crowded college choir practice, you're eventually going to get wet. It's an exposure problem, not a faulty umbrella.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Exposure intensity matters just as much as your baseline immunity.
So we have this incredibly successful biotechnological tool that defends against the hypercontagion of measles, the fetal devastation of rubella, and the painful complications of mumps. How did something so effective become one of the most controversial topics in modern society?
To understand how a lifesaver became a flashpoint for vaccine hesitancy, we have to look closely at the Wakefield affair.
And just to be clear for you listening, our aim here is to impartially report the historical record exactly as outlined in the source document, detailing the event and the rigorous data that followed.
Right. According to the sources, the controversy stems from a 1998 paper published in The Lancet by Andrew Wakefield. Based on a sample size of just 12 children, he claimed to have found a link between the MMR vaccine, bowel disease, and autism.
Just 12 kids.
Yeah. And the impact of this single publication was immediate and massive. Vaccination rates in the UK fell sharply, creating vulnerabilities that took over a decade to repair.
But when other scientists tried to replicate his findings, they just couldn't. And eventually, an investigative journalist named Brian Deer spent years pulling on the threads of how that 1998 paper was actually put together.
And Deer's investigation revealed severe ethical and scientific breaches. He uncovered that Wakefield had undisclosed financial conflicts of interest. He was actively being funded by lawyers who were seeking to sue vaccine manufacturers.
Wow.
Furthermore, Deer found that the clinical data for the 12 children had been altered to fit the narrative, and the subjects were carefully selected rather than randomly sampled.
So the foundation of the study was entirely compromised. The Lancet fully retracted the paper in 2010, and Britain's General Medical Council struck Wakefield off the medical register, citing serious professional misconduct.
Exactly. And in the wake of that initial fear, the global scientific community conducted massive population-level studies to investigate any potential link.
What did they find?
Well, the source material highlights a definitive 2019 Danish cohort study led by Anders H. Tveit. They tracked over 657,000 children over several years. The conclusion was absolute. There is no association whatsoever between MMR vaccination and autism, even when looking specifically at children who already possessed environmental or genetic autism risk factors.
So what does this all mean for us today? The U.S. declared measles eliminated in 2000, but these outbreaks show elimination is just a temporary status, right? Because the herd immunity threshold is 95%. Even a tiny drop in confidence creates a crack in the dam that this virus instantly finds.
It does. And the source document outlines the very real, often tragic consequences of communities letting their guard down. We can see the cost of falling coverage in multiple recent events, like the 2014 to 2015 Disneyland measles outbreak.
Right.
It spread across multiple states and international borders, infecting over 100 people, almost all of whom were unvaccinated. But perhaps the most devastating example of how fragile public health consensus can be is the 2019 Samoa epidemic.
Yeah, the details on Samoa show how quickly misinformation can weaponize a tragedy.
In 2018, 2 infants in Samoa died shortly after receiving the MMR vaccine. It was a horrific event, but investigations quickly revealed it was a medical error.
What exactly happened?
Nurses had mistakenly reconstituted the freeze-dried vaccine powder with an expired liquid muscle relaxant instead of the correct sterile water diluent.
So it was a human error in administration, completely unrelated to the safety of the vaccine itself.
Exactly. Yet, anti-vaccine activists, some even traveling internationally to intervene, seized upon this tragedy. They flooded the island with misinformation, driving public trust into the ground. Vaccination coverage in Samoa plummeted to roughly 31%.
Which is terrifying when we remember that measles requires a 95% threshold for herd immunity.
And the inevitable result arrived the following year. A massive measles epidemic swept through the susceptible population, resulting in over 5,700 cases and 83 deaths, overwhelmingly claiming the lives of children under 5 years old.
And these vulnerabilities aren't limited to island nations. We saw the largest U.S. measles resurgence in decades in New York in 2019, and a severe outbreak in West Texas in 2025 that resulted in the first U.S. measles deaths in 10 years, again, primarily in unvaccinated children.
Right.
The U.S. famously declared measles eliminated back in 2000, but these outbreaks demonstrate that elimination is just a temporary fragile status.
Elimination simply means there's an absence of continuous year-round domestic transmission. But viruses travel on airplanes every day. If measles is imported into a community where the vaccination rate has slipped below that 95% threshold, the elimination status is instantly broken.
The virus will find the cracks.
Exactly. Maintaining elimination requires constant, vigilant upkeep of our collective immunity.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started by deconstructing a common acronym into 3 distinct threats. We explored the unparalleled airborne contagiousness of measles and its insidious ability to wipe out immune memory. We looked at rubella's silent, devastating impact on fetal development and how mumps teaches us that intense exposure can overwhelm baseline immunity. Finally, we trace the lasting global fallout of a retracted 1998 study and the tragic realities of what happens when vaccination rates drop.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the story of MMR is a perfect intersection of disciplines. It combines brilliant virology, complex epidemiology, and the fragile, sometimes unpredictable sociology of human behavior.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over on your own, building on something we touched on at the very beginning. We noted that RNA viruses, like the ones that cause seasonal flu or COVID-19, are sloppy copiers.
Right, they mutate.
They mutate and drift constantly, which is why we have to formulate a new flu shot every single year. But the source material highlights a crucial biological quirk about measles, mumps, and rubella. They are what scientists call antigenically stable.
They do not drift or shift in any meaningful way. The outward structure of the viruses remains fundamentally the same decade after decade.
Which is exactly why Maurice Hilleman's single vaccine formulation from 1971 still works flawlessly today, because these specific viruses don't change their disguises. True global eradication, literally wiping them off the face of the earth forever, just like we achieved with smallpox, is 100% biologically possible.
It is.
We already hold the ultimate weapon in our hands. The only barrier left preventing us from making these diseases completely extinct isn't a biological mystery. It is simply human behavior.
The science has successfully done its part. The final step relies entirely on our collective will to use the tools we have.
It's an incredible realization. Think back to that murky, overlapping X-ray of diagnoses from a century ago. When it comes to the biology of MMR today, the science is actually crystal clear. The only murkiness left comes from us. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and stay curious.